The first rays of the sun sweep over the Andes, their golden light catching the jagged peaks like a whispered promise of life. In the Amazon, the jungle stirs, howler monkeys roar their morning call, piercing through the thick canopy of emerald green. Further south, the vast expanse of Patagonia stretches in silence, where icy winds dance over glaciers and endless plains. South America is a symphony of contrasts, each note resonating with untamed beauty and timeless rhythm. The Andes, the backbone of the continent, rise with a defiance that seems almost human. Stretching from Venezuela to Chile, these mountains are guardians of stories older than memory. Glaciers crown their heights, while below, valleys cradle cities where ancient and modern worlds collide. The air at their peaks is thin but filled with whispers of the past, where every step feels like walking on sacred ground. Turn eastward, and the Amazon basin opens up like a green ocean, a labyrinth of life so vast it feels infinite. The river itself is a giant serpent, winding its way through the forest, bringing both nourishment and mystery. The trees stand tall like elders, their roots plunging into the earth, while their branches cradle countless species of birds, mammals, and insects. This is where life refuses to be ordinary. It's loud, vibrant, and unrelenting, each creature shouting its existence into the cacophony of the jungle. The pampas of Argentina, on the other hand, feel like the world exhaling. Endless grasslands stretch to the horizon, where the skies meet the earth in a quiet embrace. Gauchos, with their wide-brimmed hats and rugged faces, still ride their horses here, embodying the spirit of independence that these lands have nurtured for centuries. Their life moves to a rhythm dictated by the seasons and the herds, unchanging and enduring. In the west, the Atacama Desert offers a stark, almost alien beauty. The driest place on earth, it defies logic by harboring life in the harshest conditions. At night, the skies over the desert transform into a masterpiece of stars, so brilliant and clear they make you feel like a grain of sand in an infinite universe. It's a place where silence speaks louder than words, and every grain of sand holds a secret of resilience. As you venture south, the continent begins to breathe differently. Patagonia's icy wilderness challenges everything it touches. Glaciers carve their way through valleys, creating landscapes so raw they seem untouched by time. Penguins waddle along rocky shores, and condors soar above jagged cliffs, their wings outstretched against the unforgiving wind. The cold bites here, but it also invigorates, like a reminder of life's relentless persistence. Even the islands off the mainland hold their own magic. The Galapagos Islands, scattered like forgotten jewels in the Pacific, have been nature's laboratory for millennia. Here, creatures evolve in ways that defy logic, giant tortoises lumber through volcanic terrain, and blue-footed boobies perform their comical mating dances. Every wave that laps these shores carries the whispers of change, reminding us that nothing in nature stands still. But South America isn't just its landscapes, it's the pulse that connects them all. The Amazon rains feed rivers that sustain communities far downstream. The Andes guard mineral wealth that has shaped economies and histories. The winds that sweep across the pampas carry seeds and stories alike. Every corner of the continent is linked in a fragile, awe-inspiring balance, like an intricate puzzle that nature has spent millions of years perfecting. The climates here are as varied as the landscapes. Tropical rainforests breathe life into the planet, their constant warmth and humidity fostering an explosion of growth. Just a few thousand miles away, high-altitude plateaus shiver under frosty nights, their arid soils nurturing hardy plants and even hardier people. Coastal regions bask in sunlight, while the southern reaches of the continent embrace winter's chill with a stoic grace. And yet, beneath the beauty lies a fierce struggle. The Amazon, often called the lungs of the earth, faces threats that could silence its heartbeat forever. Glaciers in the Andes, some of the most vital water sources for millions, retreat inch by inch as the planet warms. The delicate ecosystems of the Galapagos are more fragile than ever, their balance easily tipped by human hands. But even in struggle, there is resilience. In the Andes, farmers still cultivate quinoa and potatoes on ancient terraces carved into the mountainside, just as their ancestors did. In the Amazon, indigenous communities fight to protect their lands with a bravery that echoes through the ages. On the Pampas, ranchers adapt to changing climates with the same determination that has kept their traditions alive for generations. This continent doesn't just show the power of nature, it embodies the strength of survival. It reminds us that beauty often comes from contrasts, from the clash of extremes that shape and define life. It's a place where fire meets ice, where forests stretch endlessly and deserts whisper of eternity, where ancient civilizations left footprints still visible today. It is the beating heart of a world that feels alive in every sense of the word. The fire crackled softly in the cool night air, casting flickering shadows on the stone walls of a shelter. Around it, a small group of people huddled together, their faces illuminated by the orange glow. The scent of charred wood mixed with the faint aroma of smoked meat. These were not modern people, but the first whispers of humanity on a land still wild and untamed, South America. They were survivors, innovators, and dreamers, carving out lives against the odds in a place that had never known human footsteps before. Thousands of years ago, when vast glaciers still gripped the northern lands, humans began their long migration. Some walked across icy land bridges, driven by a pull they couldn't explain. Others followed rivers and coastlines, their journeys marked by salt spray and the cries of seabirds. Every step brought them closer to the unknown, closer to a continent waiting to be shaped by their presence. Monteverde, a quiet patch of land in southern Chile, holds echoes of these early wanderers. It isn't much to look at today, just a grassy field bordered by a stream, but beneath its surface lies evidence of lives lived thousands of years ago. The ground here has preserved what time and nature usually erase: wooden tools, bits of animal hide, even remnants of food. It's as if the land refused to forget. Archaeologists unearthed Monteverde in the late 20th century, and what they found shattered long-held beliefs. Here were the remains of a small community, a people who lived over 14,000 years ago, thousands of years earlier than anyone thought humans had reached South America. They had built simple shelters from wood and animal hides. They cooked meat and gathered wild plants, their diet as varied as the land itself. A piece of mastodon meat was found, perfectly preserved, its fibers still recognizable. It was a small detail, but it spoke volumes. These people weren't just surviving, they were thriving. They had learned to hunt massive beasts, to tame fire, and to adapt to a world that was both beautiful and merciless. Further evidence suggested their resourcefulness went beyond mere survival. Plant remains hinted at early experiments with healing and medicine. Tools carved from bone and stone showed ingenuity and craftsmanship. These weren't aimless wanderers, they were thinkers, creators, and problem solvers, capable of looking at the wild chaos around them and making sense of it. Their lives weren't without struggle. The icy winds that swept through the region could chill a person to the bone. The forests they relied on for shelter and food were filled with predators, their eyes gleaming in the darkness. And yet, they endured. Every arrow they carved, every fire they built, every footstep they took was an act of quiet defiance against the elements. But Monteverde is only part of the story. Across South America, traces of early human life tell a tale of resilience and discovery. In Brazil, the Serra de Capivara caves hold ancient paintings, scenes of hunters, dancers, and animals etched onto the rock faces. These images are whispers from a time before history, a reminder that humans have always sought to leave their mark. On the coast of Peru, shell middens stand as silent monuments to lives centered around the sea. These heaps of discarded shells and bones are more than garbage, they are the fingerprints of a culture that thrived by fishing and gathering, finding abundance where others might see only desolation. Even high in the Andes, where the air grows thin and the cold bites harder, there are signs of ancient life. Tools and footprints tell of people who braved the heights, finding ways to survive in a world where the mountains seemed to touch the sky. What drove these early settlers to such extremes? Was it curiosity, hunger, or a need to escape something left behind? We may never know, but their determination speaks for itself. They crossed deserts and mountains, rivers and forests, carving paths where none existed. The story of South America's first settlers is not one of conquest or domination but of harmony and adaptation. They didn't just take from the land, they learned from it, lived with it, and found ways to thrive within its rhythms. Their footsteps were gentle, their impact light, yet they left behind the seeds of a legacy that would grow into civilizations. Today, the winds still whisper through Monteverde, carrying the echoes of those early lives. The streams murmur their stories, flowing over the stones that once bore human hands. South America remembers, even when the rest of the world forgets. It holds its past in the soil, the rocks, and the air, preserving the memory of a time when humanity was young and the land was vast and full of promise. The wind whispered across the high altiplano, carrying with it the faint echoes of stone tools striking against massive blocks, the rhythmic hum of voices working in unison, and the soft lapping of waves from the nearby Lake Titicaca. The world here, perched at dizzying altitudes, seemed suspended between earth and sky. It was a place where the air was thin, but the ambitions of its people were boundless. Rising from these desolate plains was Tiwanaku, a city unlike anything the ancient world had known. Its massive stone gateways and sprawling plazas seemed to defy reason. How could humans, with no iron tools or wheels, craft such immense monuments? And yet they had, shaping their world with skill, ingenuity, and a vision that stretched beyond the horizons. The stones of Tiwanaku, some weighing as much as 100 tons, were cut with precision so fine that even a blade of grass couldn't slide between their seams. The city wasn't just a collection of buildings, it was a masterpiece. Every wall, every carving, every avenue spoke of a people who understood the interplay of nature, humanity, and the divine. Water was life here, and the engineers of Tiwanaku knew it well. They constructed an intricate network of canals and raised fields, turning the high-altitude plains into fertile farmland. The canals not only irrigated crops, but also moderated the temperature, protecting plants from the biting cold of the Andean nights. It was innovation born of necessity, but it became art in their hands. Beyond the practical, there was a spiritual heartbeat to Tiwanaku. At its heart stood the Gateway of the Sun, a massive monolith carved with intricate depictions of celestial beings. The figures, their faces solemn and mysterious, seemed to gaze out over the land as if guarding secrets of time and space. The alignment of the structures suggested a profound understanding of astronomy, with solstices and equinoxes marking the rhythms of life. To the north, in what is now Peru, another civilization was rising. The Wari people, bold and ambitious, were shaping their own legacy. Unlike the centralized splendor of Tiwanaku, the Wari built a network of cities, each connected by roads that cut through mountains, valleys, and deserts. Their roads were more than pathways, they were lifelines, channels through which culture, trade, and ideas flowed. In Wari cities, rectangular buildings stood in orderly rows, their walls painted with bright, geometric designs. The people worked tirelessly, weaving vibrant textiles that told stories of gods, animals, and daily life. These textiles, created with dyes extracted from plants and minerals, were not just decorative, they were treasures, valued more than gold. The Wari, like their Tiwanaku counterparts, were masters of agriculture. They transformed barren hillsides into terraces, each step a garden carved into the mountains. With their irrigation systems, they coaxed life from the unforgiving earth, growing maize, quinoa, and other crops that sustained their flourishing cities. But the Wari weren't just farmers or builders, they were visionaries. They developed a system of governance that allowed their influence to spread across vast distances. Through alliances, trade, and a shared cultural identity, they united diverse peoples under a single banner. Their legacy was one of connection, of weaving together the fragmented pieces of the Andean world into something greater than the sum of its parts. Tiwanaku and Wari were different in many ways, one a city of soaring stone, the other a network of thriving urban centers. Yet they were bound by a shared spirit, a belief in the power of human effort to shape the natural world and a reverence for the land that sustained them. Their achievements weren't just feats of engineering or governance, they were expressions of hope, resilience, and a deep understanding of the delicate balance between survival and greatness. When their time passed, their echoes remained. The Inca, who would later rise to unparalleled heights, walked roads laid by the Wari and studied the agricultural techniques perfected by Tiwanaku. The foundations of their empire rested on the shoulders of those who came before, on the stones of Tiwanaku's temples and the terraces of Wari's hillsides. Even now, standing amidst the ruins of Tiwanaku or tracing the ancient paths of the Wari, it's impossible not to feel their presence. The air still vibrates with the energy of their dreams, and the land still carries the marks of their hands. They remind us of what is possible when people come together, when they dare to imagine a world bigger than themselves, and when they pour their hearts into building something that lasts. The air in the Andes carried a strange, almost sacred stillness. Towering mountains stretched endlessly, their snow-capped peaks touching the clouds. Beneath them, the land pulsed with life, terraced fields spiraled up hillsides, and roads, impossibly straight, threaded through valleys and over ridges. This was no ordinary landscape, it was the backbone of an empire, crafted by a people who had turned the impossible into reality. At its heart was Cusco, a city cradled by mountains and kissed by the sun. Its stone walls fit so tightly together that not even a blade of grass could slip between them. This was the center of the Inca world, the navel of their universe. Here, the Sapa Inca, the child of the sun, ruled with divine authority, his every word a command that rippled across the vast expanse of his empire. The Incas were not conquerors in the sense of brute force alone. They were architects of unity. When they expanded their empire, they brought more than soldiers, they brought roads, terraces, and the promise of belonging. Tribes that once stood isolated in the harsh Andean wilderness now found themselves part of something greater, connected by the threads of an empire that stretched from the deserts of northern Peru to the icy tips of Patagonia. The roads were their lifeblood, an engineering marvel that snaked through mountains and crossed rivers with rope bridges that seemed to defy gravity. Messengers called chasquis sprinted along these paths, carrying messages in the form of quipus, knotted strings that held a language of numbers and patterns. The chasquis ran tirelessly, their feet pounding the earth, ensuring the empire's heartbeat never faltered. In the villages, farmers tended to their crops under the watchful gaze of the Apis, the mountain gods. Their work was meticulous, guided by an agricultural calendar that harmonized with the cycles of the sun and moon. The terraced fields they worked were more than just farms, they were masterpieces, each layer carved with care, each stone placed with purpose. These terraces fed millions, their bounty sustaining the empire even in the face of drought or famine. But it wasn't just the land they mastered, it was their people. The empire was a finely tuned machine, each part working in harmony. At its core was the Elu, the community, where everyone had a role. Land was divided equally, ensuring no one went without. MITA, a labor system that required citizens to contribute to state projects, wasn't just a duty, it was a privilege, a chance to build temples, roads, and fortresses that would stand for generations. Their temples were testaments to their devotion. The Coricancha, or Temple of the Sun, in Cusco was adorned with gold so bright it seemed to hold the sun itself. Priests offered prayers and sacrifices, their chants rising into the thin mountain air. The Incas believed they were chosen by Inti, the sun god, to bring order to the world, and every stone they laid was an act of faith. But even the strongest empires are vulnerable to shadows they cannot see. Far to the east, beyond the horizon, ships carried men who would forever change the Andes. These strangers brought weapons that gleamed like the sun and diseases that moved like ghosts, unseen and unstoppable. When Francisco Pizarro and his men reached Inca lands, they found an empire weakened by civil war. The great Sapa Inca Huayna Capac had died, and his sons, Atahualpa and Huáscar, had turned against each other in a bitter struggle for the throne. The land was scarred, its unity fractured. Atahualpa, victorious but weary, met the Spaniards with confidence. His people had never known an enemy they couldn't overcome. But the Spaniards fought differently. Their steel swords and horses were alien, their methods cruel and cunning. When they captured Atahualpa, the empire's spirit faltered. The ransom demanded by Pizarro was unimaginable, a room filled with gold and two more with silver. The Incas brought the treasure, their hands trembling as they piled their sacred objects into the invaders' grasp. But even this wasn't enough to save their emperor. Atahualpa was executed, and with him died the heart of the empire. The Spaniards moved through the land like a storm, dismantling what had taken centuries to build. Temples were stripped, cities burned, and roads fell silent. Yet, the mountains stood witness, carrying the memories of a people who had conquered the Andes not with swords, but with their minds, hearts, and hands. The spirit of the Inca endures in the terraces that still feed villages, in the ruins of Machu Picchu perched high above the clouds, and in the whispers of Quechua, the language that continues to flow through Andean valleys. The empire may have fallen, but its story lives on, carved into the stones of the Andes and the souls of its descendants. The ocean stretched endlessly, a vast expanse of shifting blues under an unbroken sky. For months, the ships had creaked and groaned as they ventured further into the unknown. Men clung to the hope that the horizon would yield something extraordinary, golden lands whispered about in half-believed legends. The salty air was thick with the scent of sweat, fear, and dreams. Then, one morning, it happened. A shout broke the dawn's quiet. Land! The cry ignited a storm of emotions, relief, anticipation, and a tinge of something darker, hunger for conquest. The ships were Spanish, their sails bearing the emblem of a kingdom hungry for glory. Below deck, the sailors spoke in hushed tones of the riches they would claim and the adventures awaiting them. Above, the captains, hardened and ambitious, plotted their course with precision. They were not explorers in the purest sense, they were men driven by promises of wealth, land, and power. When their feet touched the shore, it was a different world entirely. The air was heavy with the fragrance of unfamiliar plants, the ground soft with leaves that seemed to whisper underfoot. It was not the world they had left behind, it was richer, wilder, and alive with possibilities they could scarcely comprehend. But they were not alone. Watching from the shadows of the trees were the eyes of people who had lived on this land for millennia. The strangers, with their gleaming armor and foreign tongues, seemed to rise from the sea itself, their presence both fascinating and terrifying. The indigenous peoples had no word for conqueror, no concept for the storm about to descend. When the two worlds met, the silence was deafening. The Spaniards held gifts, beads, mirrors, trinkets that sparkled in the sunlight. To the indigenous people, these objects were strange, almost magical. They accepted them with curiosity, unaware of the intentions behind the gestures. In return, they offered food, corn, cassava, and fruits so vibrant they seemed to glow. The Spaniards tasted and marveled, but behind their smiles were calculations. The initial encounters were marked by wonder on both sides. The indigenous people marveled at the Spaniards' horses, creatures they had never seen, towering and powerful. The Europeans were equally astonished by the richness of the land and the intricate societies they encountered, villages bustling with life, fields meticulously cultivated, and cities where gold gleamed in temples and ornaments. But beneath the surface of all was an undercurrent of tension. The Spaniards saw opportunity, not just in the land, but in the people themselves. Their eyes lingered on the gold, their minds racing with thoughts of how to claim it. The indigenous peoples, for their part, began to sense the weight of the visitors' intentions. The gifts became demands, and the smiles carried shadows. Further south, Portuguese ships hugged the coast of Brazil. They, too, marveled at the land's beauty and abundance. Here, towering forests stretched endlessly, filled with exotic birds whose feathers seemed dipped in sunlight. They encountered the Tupi people, whose lives were intertwined with the rhythms of the forest. The Tupi welcomed the visitors at first, their hospitality born of a belief in reciprocity. But the Portuguese saw the trees not as sacred but as timber, the land not as home but as a resource to exploit. Every meeting left a mark. Words were exchanged, alliances hesitantly formed, and misunderstandings piled high. For the Europeans, the indigenous people were a puzzle to solve, a barrier to overcome. For the native peoples, the strangers were a question with no clear answer. Were they gods? Were they enemies? Or were they simply lost souls, as fragile and human as anyone? Then came the shift. The Spaniards began to assert control, their intentions no longer veiled. They planted crosses in the soil, claiming the land in the name of kings thousands of miles away. They demanded tribute, gold, and labor, often with violence. The indigenous people, so deeply rooted in their own ways of life, could not understand this greed, this hunger for more than the earth could reasonably give. Conflicts arose. Words turned into arguments, and arguments into bloodshed. The Spaniards wielded weapons of steel and iron, tools that shattered wooden shields and pierced soft flesh. But the greatest devastation was unseen, diseases carried across the ocean. Smallpox, measles, and influenza swept through villages like an invisible plague, leaving emptiness in their wake. Entire communities vanished, their voices silenced before they could fully grasp what had arrived. For the Spaniards and Portuguese, these were victories, evidence that the land was theirs to take. For the indigenous peoples, it was a tragedy too immense to comprehend. Families were torn apart, traditions disrupted, and entire ways of life extinguished. Yet, amid the chaos, there were moments of quiet resistance. Leaders rose, not with swords, but with words, urging their people to stand firm. The land itself seemed to mourn, its rivers running heavy and its forests holding secrets of a world that was rapidly changing. This meeting of two worlds was not just an encounter, it was a collision, an irreversible blending of lives, cultures, and fates. The Europeans, with their ships and steel, brought destruction, but they also carried stories, foods, and ideas that would leave traces in South America forever. The indigenous peoples, though deeply scarred, left their own mark, their traditions and resilience shaping the new world being forced upon them. And through it all, the land remained, the towering Andes, the endless Amazon, and the shores that had first welcomed the ships. The land remembered, even when the people forgot. It carried the weight of these first encounters in its soil, in its forests, and in its silent, watchful mountains. The morning sun crept over the Andes, its golden rays touching the peaks with a fleeting sense of peace. In the distance, the great city of Cusco stood proud, a marvel of stone and ingenuity. Its walls told stories of a people who had tamed the harshest mountains and turned them into a thriving empire. Yet, the air felt heavy, as if the earth itself knew what was coming. The streets were alive with movement, merchants trading, children laughing, priests preparing offerings to the gods. But behind the daily rhythm of life, there was unease. Far away, on the coast, men with strange armor and faces burned by the sun gathered their forces. Francisco Pizarro, their leader, was no stranger to hardship. He had grown up in poverty, and ambition burned in him like a fire that would not be quenched. He had heard tales of a kingdom rich beyond imagination, of gold and treasures that could make any man a king. It was this dream that drove him forward, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. Pizarro and his men crossed the rugged terrain with determination etched on their faces. Their journey was not easy. They faced biting winds, hunger, and the unknown dangers of a land they did not understand. Yet, they pressed on, each step taking them closer to the heart of the Inca Empire. When they finally reached Cajamarca, they found themselves standing before Atahualpa, the Inca emperor. Atahualpa was a ruler whose power was unquestioned. Draped in garments adorned with gold and feathers, he sat with an air of confidence, unaware that his world was on the brink of collapse. He saw Pizarro's forces not as a threat but as a curiosity, foreigners with strange weapons and customs who could be swayed or dismissed. What he did not know was that these men had come to tear apart everything he held dear. The first meeting between the Spaniards and the Incas was tense. Pizarro and his men, vastly outnumbered, hid their fear behind steely determination. The Incas, on the other hand, watched with fascination and confusion. The Spaniards spoke of gods, of submission, of a king far away who demanded obedience. Atahualpa listened but remained unmoved. In his mind, no power on earth could rival the strength of the Inca. But Pizarro had no intention of leaving negotiations to chance. On a fateful day, as Atahualpa entered Cajamarca with his entourage, the Spaniards unleashed their trap. Hidden cannons roared to life, and chaos erupted. The air was filled with screams and the acrid smell of gunpowder. In a matter of hours, the emperor of the mightiest empire in South America was a prisoner. The capture of Atahualpa sent shockwaves through the Inca world. How could their divine ruler, the son of the sun, be reduced to a captive. The Spaniards demanded gold and silver as ransom, and the Incas, desperate to free their leader, complied. Room after room was filled with treasures beyond imagining, ornate jewelry, ceremonial artifacts, and blocks of precious metal that shimmered in the light. But even this staggering display of wealth could not save Atahualpa. Pizarro's decision to execute the emperor was both calculated and ruthless. Without their leader, the Incas were thrown into disarray. The once united empire fractured, its people left vulnerable to the relentless advance of the Spanish forces. Towns were raided, temples desecrated, and centuries of culture reduced to ashes. The sacred sites of the Incas, places where generations had worshipped and celebrated, were turned into symbols of conquest. For the indigenous population, the arrival of the Spaniards was not just a loss of land or wealth, it was a shattering of their very identity. The world they had known, the gods they prayed to, the traditions that shaped their lives, was systematically erased. Disease spread faster than swords, decimating communities and leaving villages empty. Smallpox and measles claimed more lives than any battle, robbing the Incas of their strength before they could even fight back. Yet, even in the face of such devastation, there was resistance. In the highlands and jungles, pockets of Inca warriors continued to fight. They knew their odds were slim, but they refused to let their legacy fade without a struggle. Leaders like Manco Inca rallied their people, launching daring raids and defending strongholds with unmatched courage. Their resistance was not just about survival, it was a defiance against an enemy that sought to erase their existence. The conquest of the Incas was not just the fall of an empire, it was the end of a way of life that had flourished for centuries. It was a moment when the Andes, once a cradle of innovation and beauty, became a battlefield. Yet, the spirit of the Inca people did not vanish entirely. It lived on in their descendants, in the stories passed down through generations, in the terraces that still cling to the mountains, and in the quiet strength of a culture that refused to be forgotten. Through it all, the land stood silent, bearing witness to the clash of two worlds. The mountains that had nurtured the Incas watched as their cities were reduced to ruins. The rivers that had sustained their crops flowed with the memories of what had been lost. And the earth itself seemed to carry the weight of a history forever changed. The winds carried whispers of change as the vast landscapes of South America lay beneath skies filled with uncertainty. The mountains stood tall, unyielding, as if trying to shield their secrets, while the rivers carved their relentless paths through the continent. But the land was no longer its own. The flags of distant empires flew over its cities, and the voices of two worlds clashed in an uneasy symphony of control and survival. When the Treaty of Tordesillas was signed, it was not the land that decided its fate, but men in far-off courts who drew lines on maps. Spain claimed the western expanse, while Portugal was granted the eastern stretch, a division as arbitrary as it was monumental. To the people who lived here, these invisible boundaries meant nothing at first, yet their lives would soon be shaped entirely by them. The treaty turned vast territories into chessboards, where kings and queens moved their pawns, ignorant of the lives they were altering forever. The Spanish moved swiftly, determined to carve an empire that stretched from the coasts to the peaks. They established the Viceroyalty of Peru, a jewel in the crown of Spanish America. Lima became the beating heart of this vast realm, its streets filled with the hum of commerce and conquest. Silver flowed from the mines of Potosí, a mountain that seemed endless in its wealth and bottomless in its cost. Indigenous men labored under grueling conditions, their hands pulling treasures from the earth, while their spirits were weighed down by the loss of their freedom. The Portuguese, meanwhile, turned their focus to the eastern lands that would become Brazil. They built sugar plantations along the coasts, their wealth fed by the forced labor of enslaved Africans. The forests that once thrived with the songs of birds and rustle of leaves now echoed with the cries of the oppressed. Ships crossed the Atlantic in endless waves, their cargoes filled with human lives, reduced to mere commodities in a trade that scarred the continent and the soul of humanity. The division of South America was not without tension. The borders, though agreed upon in words, were battlegrounds in reality. Settlers pushed against the invisible lines, their ambitions unchecked by distant decrees. Missionaries moved into uncharted lands, determined to convert and control, bringing with them not just new faiths, but new diseases, which swept through indigenous communities with devastating force. Entire villages were left silent, their homes abandoned, their people lost. Within the Viceroyalty of New Granada, established to the north, the Spanish created a system designed to extract as much as possible from the land and its people. Cities like Bogotá and Cartagena became hubs of power, while the surrounding countryside bore the weight of exploitation. The encomienda system bound indigenous communities to Spanish overlords, who claimed both their labor and their loyalty. It was a relationship built on imbalance, where resistance was met with brutality and compliance came at the cost of identity. Yet, amidst the control and division, there were moments of resilience. In the highlands, in the dense jungles, and along the rugged coasts, indigenous people found ways to preserve fragments of their heritage. They wove their stories into their textiles, hid their rituals in the shadows of Catholic ceremonies, and passed down their songs in whispers. The land itself became their ally, its vastness offering refuge and resistance against the forces that sought to claim it. Back in Europe, the riches of South America fueled the ambitions of empires. Gold and silver filled the coffers of kings, financing wars and building palaces, while those who labored to extract it lived and died in obscurity. The sugar that sweetened noble tables came at the cost of untold suffering, a bitter truth that few dared to acknowledge. The division of South America, so casually decided, became a source of endless exploitation, its consequences rippling across oceans and generations. But no empire could fully control the heart of a land so vast, so alive. The mountains whispered to those who listened, the forests shielded those who fled, and the rivers carried memories of what had been. For every law imposed, there was defiance. For every chain, there was a will to break free. The story of South America was not just one of conquest and division, but also of endurance and hope, written not in the halls of viceroys, but in the hearts of its people. The sun rose slowly over the sprawling estates, casting its golden light on fields that stretched as far as the eye could see. In the early morning haze, the rhythmic sound of feet against the soil echoed faintly, a reminder of the lives bound to this land. Each step told a story of toil, a silent testimony to resilience and hardship. Life in colonial South America was a mosaic of contrasts. The encomienda system was at its core, a structure that tied indigenous communities to Spanish landowners under the guise of protection and religious instruction. But the reality was harsh. Men, women, and children labored endlessly in fields, mines, and workshops, their lives tightly controlled by those who claimed dominion over them. The promise of safety and faith was a thin veil, hiding a system built on exploitation. On the vast haciendas, a new way of life emerged. These estates, sprawling and self-sufficient, became symbols of wealth and power. The Spanish elite lived in grand houses surrounded by lush gardens, their lives a stark contrast to the world outside their walls. Inside, life was filled with fine fabrics, imported goods, and the hum of servants who moved quietly, their presence felt but their voices unheard. Outside, the fields were alive with the effort of countless hands, planting, harvesting, and maintaining the lifeblood of the hacienda. For the indigenous people, the transition from free communities to lives dictated by the encomienda or hacienda systems was a wrenching shift. Their ancestral lands, once sacred and bountiful, became sites of endless labor. The very soil they had nurtured for generations now demanded their sweat, their strength, and sometimes their lives. Yet, in quiet moments, they whispered prayers to the spirits of the earth, calling on them for protection, for hope, for the strength to endure another day. Enslaved Africans brought to South America bore the weight of unimaginable suffering. Torn from their homelands, they arrived in a world alien and unforgiving. In the plantations of Brazil, they toiled under the relentless sun, their hands bleeding from the sharp edges of sugarcane. In the silver mines of Potosí, they descended into the earth's depths, their lungs filling with dust, their spirits heavy with despair. Yet, even in these brutal conditions, their cultures survived. Through song, dance, and quiet acts of defiance, they preserved fragments of their identities, leaving a legacy that would shape South America for generations to come. The colonists lived lives shaped by privilege, but not without challenges. They depended on the labor of others to sustain their wealth, yet they often feared rebellion and unrest. Their days were filled with the pursuit of power and status, their nights haunted by the uneasy knowledge of the cost. In their churches, they prayed for salvation, yet outside, they perpetuated systems that crushed the souls of so many. The contradiction of their existence was as stark as the divide between their lives and those they controlled. Daily life in colonial South America was a tapestry of sorrow and resilience, exploitation and quiet rebellion. Indigenous mothers sang lullabies in ancient tongues, their melodies carrying the weight of loss and the promise of continuity. Enslaved workers shared whispered stories of their homelands, each word a defiance of the erasure they faced. Even among the colonists, moments of humanity emerged, fleeting glimpses of connection that hinted at what could have been. The streets of colonial cities were alive with activity, a chaotic mix of cultures and classes. Indigenous traders offered their wares, their faces marked by the burdens they carried. African drummers played rhythms that spoke of lands far away, drawing crowds who listened with curiosity and reverence. Spanish merchants haggled over prices, their voices rising above the hum of the marketplace. In this mingling of lives, there was tension, but there was also the spark of something new, a culture born of collision and coexistence. The mountains, rivers, and forests that framed these lives bore silent witness to the struggles below. They stood as reminders of what had been and what was lost, their beauty undiminished by the weight of history. In the shadow of these natural wonders, the people of colonial South America endured. They worked, they dreamed, they resisted. And in their resilience, they laid the foundation for what the continent would one day become. It began with whispers. Quiet murmurs in the corners of darkened rooms, carried on the wind of change. The world was shifting, and South America, still bound by chains of colonial rule, could feel the tremors beneath its feet. Across the oceans, revolutions were taking shape, and with them, the stirrings of a new world. The air was thick with the words of freedom, echoing from lands far away, stirring hearts and minds in places long silenced. In Europe, the Enlightenment had set minds aflame. Thinkers questioned everything, old systems, ancient authorities, and the very foundations of society. Their ideas spread like fire, traveling across oceans, carried by books and word of mouth. In the hearts of the oppressed, the words of liberty, equality, and fraternity resonated. The American Revolution had already shown them that it was possible to rise, to break free from the bonds of tyranny. And soon, the winds of change would blow through South America, too. The mighty empires that had once ruled with impunity now faced a world awakening to the possibilities of self-determination. The French Revolution added fuel to the fire, as the cries of liberté, égalité, fraternité rang out from the streets of Paris, reverberating across the Atlantic. For the first time in centuries, the oppressed saw a glimmer of hope. The idea of freedom wasn't just a dream, it was within reach. The idea of independence wasn't just a fantasy, it could become reality. From the heart of the continent, voices rose. The men and women who had long suffered under colonial rule, the ones whose names had never been written in the history books, were beginning to find their courage. They had learned the lessons of revolution from afar, from the struggles of the United States, from the triumphs and tragedies of France. The time for change had come. But who would lead them? Who could rise from the shadows of oppression and spark a fire that would burn across the continent? Simón Bolívar, a name now etched in the history of South America, stepped forward. He was a man driven by vision, by the promise of a united and free continent. Bolívar's passion for liberty was contagious, and it spread like wildfire. He dreamed not only of his own country's freedom but of the entire continent's independence. From the mountains of Venezuela, he rose with a heart full of hope and a mind set on revolution. Every battle he fought, every victory he won, was not just for one nation, but for the freedom of a people long oppressed. José de San Martín, another name that would echo across history, joined the struggle with equal fervor. The Argentine general was a man of strategy and discipline, his heart as steadfast as Bolívar's, though his approach was different. He too saw the possibility of freedom, but he knew the price. the struggle would not be easy. With every battle fought, he moved South America closer to the vision of an independent continent. San Martín, like Bolívar, was driven by something larger than himself. His was a mission not just of war, but of belief in something far more powerful, the unyielding desire for liberty. The rise of these leaders, these titans of revolution, was the spark that would ignite a fire that would spread across the continent. Bolívar and San Martín would soon find their paths intertwined in the shared cause of independence. They faced unimaginable challenges, obstacles set in their way by the might of colonial forces, the greed of foreign powers, and the deep divides between the nations they fought for. But still, they pushed forward, driven by the conviction that the dream of freedom was worth every sacrifice, every hardship. But the path to independence was never straightforward. It was a journey filled with pain, with setbacks that threatened to crush the spirit of revolution. The people who followed Bolívar and San Martín were not mere soldiers, they were dreamers, revolutionaries who believed, against all odds, that they could create something new. Their sacrifices were unimaginable. Many died in the name of liberty. Many lost their homes, their families, their very lives. And yet, their spirits burned bright, for they knew that they were part of something greater than themselves. In the cold Andean mountains, Bolívar's army fought brutal battles, the air thin and their bodies weakened by hunger and exhaustion. Yet they pressed on, each step forward a testament to their resolve. In the plains of Argentina and Chile, San Martín's forces fought with equal passion, facing down Spanish troops who thought their dominance would never be challenged. The scent of blood and gunpowder filled the air, but even in the darkest moments, the vision of freedom remained. Through betrayals, fractured alliances, and crushing defeats, the leaders of South America refused to give up. Bolívar's vision of a united continent pushed him to rally forces that seemed impossible to assemble. San Martín, though at times questioning the best path forward, never wavered in his commitment to the cause. It was a battle not only against the colonial powers, but against despair, against the weight of history itself. The cost of freedom was steep. The dreams of Bolívar and San Martín were not easily realized. The roads they traveled were filled with the bodies of those who had fallen in battle, of those who had given their lives for a dream they would never see fulfilled. But the dream endured because of the courage of those who dared to fight for it. And when, at last, the chains of colonialism began to break, it was the courage of the people, the ones who followed Bolívar and San Martín, that allowed the dream of independence to rise from the ashes of struggle. It was not the end of the story, not by any means. The road ahead was still filled with uncertainty and division. But the revolutionaries had set in motion something far greater than they had ever imagined. The spirit of liberty had been awakened, and it would never again be silenced. The sound of boots on dirt, the clash of swords, the thunder of cannons, this was the rhythm of the new world. The struggle for freedom had only just begun, and now the land that had fought so hard for liberty was about to pay the price. Across the continent, the fires of war raged. These were not the wars of kings and emperors, but of ordinary people, fighting for something far greater than themselves, freedom, identity, and a future without chains. In the high deserts of Peru, the blood of thousands was spilled at the Battle of Ayacucho. The soldiers fought in a haze of dust, under the unrelenting sun, a brutal scene of fire and smoke that would mark the end of the Spanish Empire in South America. Bolívar's army, worn down by years of relentless fighting, had finally made their stand. The troops, tired and hungry, pressed forward. The dream of independence was now within reach, but at what cost? Soldiers who had marched for months, with only the echoes of their comrades' deaths in their ears, fought for one last victory. Ayacucho would be the battle that would seal the fate of the continent, but even as the last shots rang out, there were no cheers. Only silence, the kind that follows the end of something irreversible. But the victory at Ayacucho was only one chapter in the long and bloody story of South America's fight for independence. Across the continent, in the jungles of Venezuela, the vast plains of Argentina, and the mountains of Chile, there was no rest. The battles were endless, stretching over years and taking everything from those who fought. The new republics, still fragile and in their infancy, were not yet safe from the forces that sought to tear them apart. The enemies were not just the remnants of Spanish rule, but also the divisions between the people who had long been divided by geography, culture, and class. In Venezuela, the fighting seemed endless as Simón Bolívar's forces battled against the royalist armies. The smell of gunpowder lingered in the air, thick and suffocating. Bolívar, though a hero in the eyes of the people, was not without his own doubts. He saw the war taking a toll on his soldiers, on his people. How could he promise them freedom when all they had known was war? And yet, still, they fought. The hope for a better future carried them forward, though it often seemed far away. In the rain-soaked hills of the Andes, where the green slopes were stained with blood, the courage of the soldiers became more than just a fight for victory. It became a fight to stay alive, to hold on to the dream that had begun with Bolívar's vision. In the south, José de San Martín led his forces across the towering Andes to Chile, facing impossible odds. The journey was grueling. The soldiers, already weakened by the harsh conditions, had to endure the bitter cold and the constant threat of death. Yet San Martín, a man of unshakable resolve, kept moving forward. His forces were stretched thin, supplies dwindled, but the belief in a new world kept them going. They crossed the mountains, not as soldiers, but as symbols of hope. Their feet left tracks in the snow, tracks that would one day mark the path to freedom. But it was not just the external battles that threatened the new republics. With every victory over the Spanish came a new set of challenges. The newly independent nations found themselves fractured, struggling to forge unity from the divisions that had existed long before the first shots were fired. The dream of a united continent was powerful, but it seemed increasingly distant as the years passed. Bolívar, once a symbol of unity, now found himself battling not only for the independence of his people, but for their very cooperation. In Colombia, he faced rebellion from those who had once fought beside him. In the south, San Martín's vision of a united South America was equally strained, as each nation fought to define itself on its own terms. The republics were born out of a shared desire for freedom, but maintaining that unity was another war entirely. The republics that rose from the ashes of colonialism were fragile. The governments, if they could even be called that, were unstable. They were born from struggle, yes, but also from confusion, fear, and uncertainty. New leaders emerged from the shadows of revolution, some hoping to guide their nations to a bright future, others driven by ambition, or worse. And as the new republics faced internal divisions, their enemies from abroad were always ready to strike. The Spanish were gone, but the fear of other powers, from Britain to Portugal, loomed over the land. The continent had won its freedom, but that was only the beginning. The wars for independence were not fought only on the battlefield. They were fought in the hearts and minds of the people. Bolívar, San Martín, and the other leaders were faced with the bitter reality that freedom was never going to be a simple gift. It was something to be earned, again and again. It was something that could never be taken for granted. As the battles raged on, the soldiers began to understand something that their leaders knew well: victory was not always found in the number of enemies defeated, or the land conquered. Sometimes, victory was found in surviving and holding on to the belief that a better world could emerge from the chaos. The true cost of freedom was not just measured in lives lost, but in the souls that had to endure. In the end, the wars for independence were a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. The struggles, the bloodshed, the heartache, they all made the dream of a new world more real. But it was not just the men who fought in the battles who felt the weight of that dream. It was the families who waited, the children who grew up with tales of revolution, and the generations to come who would inherit the legacy of sacrifice and hope. The wars for independence had shaped South America, but they had also shaped the hearts of its people. The scars of those wars, both visible and invisible, would remain for generations. And yet, through it all, the dream of freedom would endure, as would the memories of those who gave everything to see it realized. The ink was barely dry on the declarations of independence when the new nations of South America were already beginning to feel the weight of the world. The banners of freedom waved in the wind, but beneath them, the land trembled with uncertainty. The battlefield had been won, But the true fight was just beginning. The flags that flew proudly over these new republics were still stained with the dust of war, and the dream of a united, prosperous continent seemed both distant and fragile. In the chaos of revolution, new leaders had risen, their faces emblazoned on the pages of history, men like Simón Bolívar and José de San Martín. They were the ones who had led their people to victory. But now, with the colonial powers gone, the question remained, what comes next? The dream of a united South America was fading into the harsh reality of division. The land was scarred by decades of conflict, and the people were weary, unsure of what the future held. The dream of freedom had come at a price, and now the new nations would have to pay it. The political landscape was fractured. The republics born from the flames of revolution were now in a race against time to establish some kind of order. The divisions that had existed before independence, the divides between the rich and the poor, between the cities and the rural areas, between the Spanish settlers and the indigenous people, were now clearer than ever. The promises of equality, of liberty, seemed to fade with each passing year, as the wealthy landowners and the remnants of the old colonial elite clung to power. The streets were filled with cries for justice, but those cries often went unheard, drowned out by the clash of egos, the thirst for control, and the looming fear of another war. The economic challenges were just as harsh. The land had been bled dry by the wars, and now, with no colonial structures to rely on, the new republics were struggling to find their footing. The mines that once shimmered with gold and silver, the crops that had been grown by enslaved hands, now seemed barren. The revolutionaries had fought for freedom, but it was unclear how they would build the systems of commerce, trade, and industry needed to feed their people and support their economies. The gap between the rich and the poor grew ever wider. For the common folk, life had not improved. If anything, it had become more difficult. The land itself seemed to echo the divisions of the people. The boundaries of the new nations were not drawn with care or with understanding. Instead, they were carved out hastily, in the heat of post-war anxiety, with little consideration for the complex web of indigenous territories, languages, and cultures that had existed for centuries. The lines on the map, drawn with pens and ink, ignored the deep connections that people had to their land, to their mountains, to their rivers. What had once been one whole continent was now a patchwork of new nations, each struggling to find its place in the world. In the north, Venezuela's future was uncertain. Bolívar's dream of a united Gran Colombia was unraveling, as factions splintered off, each claiming a different vision for the future. Bolívar, exhausted by years of fighting, watched as the dream that he had fought so hard for faded away, his hope for a united South America slipping between his fingers. He had freed the people, but now they were divided, unable to stand together, unable to see beyond their own borders. The dream of unity was shattered, replaced by the hard realities of power struggles and regionalism. In the south, Argentina and Chile fought to establish themselves, their leaders desperate to prove that they could survive without the protective umbrella of colonial powers. There, too, the dream of a united continent had become little more than a fantasy. Even as these new nations tried to carve out their futures, old tensions lingered, tensions between different social classes, between the indigenous people and the Spanish descendants, between those who had fought for freedom and those who had remained loyal to the crown. Every decision, every political move, felt like a gamble. Would the people finally see the fruits of their labor, or would they slip back into the darkness from which they had fought so hard to escape? The pain of those years was still fresh. For the indigenous populations, the promises of equality and justice seemed hollow. They had been forced into the shadows once more, their lands taken, their cultures disrespected, their voices drowned out by the new powers that had risen in their place. The encomienda system that had enslaved them under the Spanish was replaced by the hacienda system, where the landowners still held the power. The revolution had freed some, but for many, it had only replaced one form of oppression with another. The new nations were left with a painful choice, to unite and face the many challenges ahead, or to fracture and risk descending into chaos. But even as leaders like Bolívar tried to hold on to the dream of a united South America, others saw opportunity in division. The political struggles became personal as generals and presidents fought for control, and the cries for liberty grew louder and more desperate. And then there were the borders, the lines that divided the land. These new nations, now bound by artificial borders drawn by colonial powers, were forced to define themselves. But what did these boundaries truly mean? Were they just lines on a map, or were they something more? In the Andes, in the jungles, in the fields of grass that stretched to the horizon, what did it matter where one nation ended and another began? The people lived across these borders for centuries, sharing histories, languages, and cultures. But now, they were forced to choose sides. The rivers no longer flowed freely from one nation to the next, the mountains no longer connected the people in the same way. And so, the land, once one, was now torn apart by boundaries that no one truly understood. And through it all, the people persevered. In the face of the new world that had been born from revolution, they continued to dream, continued to fight for a future that was uncertain, but full of hope. They knew that the birth of nations had come at a great cost. The dreams of freedom, of justice, of unity, these were not easily won. But they were worth fighting for, even if the path to that future was unclear, even if the way forward was shrouded in shadows. The birth of nations was only the beginning. The true test of South America had only just begun. The sound of marching boots echoed through the streets as another leader emerged, claiming his place at the top. The banners of the new republics fluttered in the wind, but the wind itself was fickle, blowing one way, then the other, as the promise of unity seemed more distant than ever. The nations born from the flames of revolution were still too young, their futures uncertain, their hearts scarred from years of war and struggle. And into this storm stepped men, strong men, who saw opportunity in the chaos, whose names would be whispered with both fear and awe, caudillos. With every passing day, the hope that these new nations might find peace seemed to slip further away. The idea of democracy, of a government for the people, seemed an impossible dream when strong men rose, one after another, in the wake of revolutions, each claiming more power than the last. The caudillos were not the liberators of the past, not the heroes who had fought for freedom. They were the opportunists, the ones who saw weakness and seized it. They were born from the chaos and bloodshed of the times, their power rooted in their ability to control, to command, to bend others to their will. It wasn't always the power of armies that made them leaders. Some ruled with an iron fist, others with cunning words. Their followers, desperate for stability, swore loyalty, offering their lives in exchange for promises of protection. In a land still healing from the scars of revolution, these leaders became the new foundation, though not the kind people had hoped for. They weren't kings, but they ruled as though they were. They built empires of their own, small yet mighty, in the midst of nations that couldn't seem to hold themselves together. In Argentina, Juan Manuel de Rosas was one such figure. A man with a silver tongue and a brutal hand, Rosas ruled with an iron grip over the Pampas, turning his wealth and power into a kingdom of fear. The people who once dreamed of a republic now found themselves under the rule of a man whose will was law. To speak against him was to sign your own death sentence. His enemies vanished in the night, and his supporters swelled in number, drawn to the idea of stability in a time of chaos. In the face of civil unrest and constant war, Rosas promised order, though at the cost of liberty. His name became synonymous with tyranny, and yet, for many, he was the only hope they had. In Venezuela, it was José Antonio Páez, another caudillo, whose power grew from the fire of revolution. Like Rosas, Páez understood the game of power, and he played it with the skill of a seasoned leader. He was not just a military man, but a symbol of strength to the people who had suffered so much in the struggle for independence. But the victory of independence brought its own set of problems, problems that could not be solved with guns alone. Páez's rise to power, marked by the suppression of his rivals and the establishment of his own rule, was a reflection of the fractured nature of the continent. In every republic, there was a caudillo waiting in the shadows, ready to take advantage of the political vacuum left by revolutions that had promised so much but delivered so little. The caudillos did not just represent the power of one man. They represented the pain of a continent that was broken, of people who longed for peace but could not find it. And so, they fought, not just for power, but for survival. Civil wars erupted across the land, each one leaving its own scars, its own wounds that would never heal. In Colombia, in Ecuador, in Peru, in Bolivia, the caudillos fought for control, each seeking to carve out their own territory, their own little kingdom amidst the wreckage of dreams. But even in this age of caudillos, there were those who fought against the tyranny, against the oppression. The idea of a united continent, of nations that could stand together, still lingered in the hearts of a few. Simón Bolívar's dream of Gran Colombia had faltered, but the idea of a united South America never fully died. Some believed that the caudillos, these men who were holding the reins of power, were the very reason the continent could not move forward. The political infighting, the corruption, the endless wars, it all seemed too much to bear. And yet, the caudillos, for all their faults, still commanded loyalty. Their promises, no matter how false, were sometimes the only hope left. The civil wars of the 19th century were more than just battles between armies, they were struggles for the soul of South America. The caudillos became both the reflection and the cause of the continent's pain. On the one hand, they brought order, at least for a time, but on the other, they shattered any hope of unity. Every battle fought was a step further away from the vision of a free, united South America. The dream of Bolívar's Gran Colombia, of a continent bound together by shared ideals, seemed to fade with every victory claimed by the caudillos. The conflicts between these leaders were not just military, they were deeply personal. A man like Rosas, who had once been a revolutionary hero, was now the villain in the eyes of his enemies. His once loyal soldiers, turned against him, fought for control of the land they had once bled for. Páez, too, had his rivals, men who had once stood by his side but who now sought to take what he had built. In every battle, there was more than just a thirst for power, there was a deeper struggle, a battle for the future of a continent, a struggle to define what it meant to be free. As the caudillos fought for dominance, the people of South America were caught in the middle. The soldiers who fought for these men were not just fighting for one man's vision of power, they were fighting for their homes, for their families, for a better future that seemed always just out of reach. They fought because they had no choice, because the world they lived in offered no alternatives. And for those who were caught in the middle, there was no escaping the violence, no escaping the bloodshed that stained the soil of South America. With each new caudillo that rose, and with each new war that broke out, the people of South America grew more weary, more uncertain of what the future would bring. Would there ever be a time when peace reigned? Would there ever be a time when the caudillos, with their armies and their power struggles, no longer held the land in their grip? The age of caudillos seemed endless, their battles leaving scars that would never fully heal. And through it all, the hope for a united South America, free from the tyranny of strongmen and power struggles, burned quietly in the hearts of those who had fought so hard for independence. The clang of steel echoed through the air, the sound of progress ringing out across a continent that had known so much suffering. From the dust of old battlefields, from the scars of oppression and revolt, a new world was rising. Yet, it wasn't born of any single nation or people, it was shaped by hands that weren't even its own, hands that reached across oceans, that came from distant shores, seeking a better life in the heart of South America. In the late 19th century, the land was transforming, but it was transforming through the labor, the sweat, and the dreams of thousands of people who had crossed seas to build something new. They came in waves, like a storm that swept across the land, each group bringing their hopes and their histories, their cultures and their skills. Italians, Germans, Spaniards, Poles, and Jews, each with their own story, each with their own journey of hardship and longing. And they weren't alone. From across the globe, far beyond the Atlantic, came the Chinese, Japanese, and other Asians, their eyes wide with the promise of a land that was unfamiliar, yet full of possibility. Their arrival was not always met with open arms. They were strangers, outsiders, viewed with suspicion, sometimes even with disdain. But what they brought with them was more powerful than fear, more lasting than prejudice. They brought hope. They brought a drive to build, to create, to contribute to the future of a land that was struggling to find its way. Their hands transformed the land, sometimes with hardship, sometimes with sacrifice, but always with a belief that they were creating something lasting, something for their children and their children's children. The early immigrants, particularly from Europe, found themselves in a world that was at once terrifying and full of opportunity. The world they had left behind was in turmoil, wars, poverty, hunger. But the land they came to was one of vast, untouched possibilities. They arrived in cities that were little more than dusty roads and wooden shacks, places where the future was still a dream, not a reality. And yet, as the years passed, their presence began to shape the very heart of South America. In Argentina, in Brazil, in Chile, the immigrants worked the fields, dug the mines, and labored in factories. They built railroads that stretched from one end of the continent to the other, connecting once isolated cities and towns. They forged industries that would come to define the modern world: steel, textiles, and more. They created the infrastructure that would lay the foundation for the nations that South America was becoming. The cities grew, blossoming into vibrant hubs of culture and commerce. The immigrant populations became the lifeblood of the continent's new economy, and in doing so, they changed the very nature of what it meant to live in South America. But it wasn't easy. The work was hard, grueling. The men and women who came to South America often found themselves toiling in harsh conditions, far from the homes they had left behind. They built factories that churned out goods at the cost of their own health. They worked in mines where the air was thick with dust, and the ground beneath their feet trembled with the threat of collapse. And yet, they did it because they had no choice. They had come to this land in search of a future, and they weren't about to give up on that dream. For the first time, South America began to feel the pulse of industrialization. The steam engines roared to life, their churning wheels carrying goods and people from one side of the continent to the other. Cities like Buenos Aires and Sao Paulo became bustling centers of trade, of culture, of life. The rhythm of the land began to shift as the noise of industry took root. The sound of the factories, of the trains, of the new world being built, became a part of the daily life. As the continent transformed, so did its people. The immigrants who had come seeking something better found themselves becoming a part of something bigger. They may have arrived as outsiders, but over time, they became South Americans. They took on new identities, new languages, new ways of life. Their children grew up in the cities they had helped build, speaking in the languages of their new homes, but always holding on to the languages of their parents. The old ways blended with the new, creating a patchwork of cultures that defined the very spirit of South America. Yet, beneath the surface of this growth, the wounds of the past were still fresh. For the indigenous peoples and African slaves who had been brought to these lands, the arrival of the immigrants was just another chapter in the long history of conquest and change. The land was still not theirs, not truly. The cities may have grown, the railroads may have been built, but the wealth and the power still rested in the hands of a few. The struggle for equality, for justice, was far from over. But the story of the immigrants was not one of defeat, it was one of perseverance. They came with nothing but their dreams and the will to survive. They built lives in a land that was, at first, so foreign to them. Their children became the doctors, the teachers, the workers who kept the cities alive. They created a new world for their descendants, one where they could find a place for themselves. And though the path was hard, and the challenges many, they never stopped believing in the promise of a new life. As the decades passed, the industrial age continued to shape South America. The continent was no longer a land defined by poverty and war. It was a place of growth, of change, of reinvention. The new factories, the new railroads, the new cities, they were all symbols of a continent that had been reborn, a continent that was no longer bound by its past, but was stepping forward into its future. But still, the people who had come from so far away, who had left their homes behind in search of something better, never forgot where they had come from. They passed their stories down through generations. They told their children of the hardships they had faced, the long journey that had brought them here. They told them of the land that had once seemed so distant, so unknown. And as their children grew, they carried those stories with them, along with the knowledge that they were part of something much bigger than themselves. In the end, South America was no longer just a continent of rich cultures and beautiful landscapes. It was a place where the dreams of millions, from all corners of the world, had taken root. It was a place where people had come to find a new home, and where they had built a future that would echo through the ages. The sound of industry, of construction, of life, these were the sounds of South America's heart, beating stronger than ever. The world trembled, shaking under the weight of two global storms that would forever alter the course of history. Far from the battlefield's chaos and the southern reaches of the Americas, South America watched, uncertain, as Europe erupted into flames. It was a time when distant explosions reverberated through the earth, and nations found themselves torn between neutrality and the heavy call to action. In the early days of the First World War, South America stood, largely untouched, on the sidelines. The war, a vast and cruel war, seemed a distant threat. Nations in the South remained neutral, cautious of drawing attention or conflict toward their borders. Yet, while the political leaders debated on the sidelines, the hearts of the people beat in a different rhythm. Families, with distant relatives in Europe, were torn by worry. How could the world not notice the suffering of those they loved? It wasn't long before the pressures of the world outside knocked on South America's door. Argentina, Brazil, Chile, nations like them were caught in a web of trade, diplomacy, and economic connections to the warring powers. Argentina, with its vast wealth in agriculture, was pulled into the conflict indirectly, supplying food and materials to Europe. But it was Brazil, the largest country in South America, who would take a more definitive step. In 1917, Brazil joined the Allies, sending troops to the front lines. Thousands of young men, many of them farmers or shopkeepers, were called upon to wear the uniform of soldiers, sent across the ocean to fight in the muddy trenches far from home. Their departure left a haunting emptiness, a shadow over families who had once sat together in warmth. The letters stopped coming, their return delayed for reasons no one could comprehend. When they returned, many were broken, physically, emotionally, haunted by the horrors they had witnessed. For the first time, South America tasted the bitter cost of global conflict. The wars reshaped the continent in ways that could not be understood in those early days. The economic effects were immediate. Markets fluctuated, exports decreased, and those left behind struggled to keep their homes together. Farmers in Argentina, who once grew enough food to feed the world, now faced the harsh reality of markets being thrown into turmoil. The same agricultural wealth that had been a lifeline became a burden, as the men who worked the fields had been sent to fight, and the women who remained behind were left to tend to both family and land. Through the fog of war, the tension of the second conflict in the 20th century loomed. The world had learned nothing from its past mistakes. World War II would come, and this time, South America would feel it more directly. The war would stretch its fingers into every corner of the world. Countries that had once stood back would find their own struggles intertwined with the great powers. Some remained neutral, but many could not. Argentina, in the wake of the First World War, tried to remain cautious, avoiding a full commitment. Yet, there were whispers, the ties between the new leadership and the Axis powers grew stronger, and the world watched with wariness. Brazil, on the other hand, joined the Allies once again, this time with a renewed sense of urgency and a clear purpose. Thousands more young men would be sent to the war, some never to return. They would become part of the global struggle, their names forever etched on the pages of history, their faces now faded memories of a war they did not start but fought nonetheless. But for every soldier who left, there were countless others whose lives would be forever altered by the weight of this war. The families who stayed behind, those who had once lived simple lives, now lived in the shadow of uncertainty. The economy reeled. Industries that had once thrived in relative peace were now choked by the global disruptions. The rich soil of South America, once a source of abundant wealth, now seemed to mock the hunger and hardship of those who remained. Every morning, as the sun rose over the mountains and the plains, the people of South America lived with the knowledge that their world, while far removed from the battlefields of Europe and the Pacific, was still profoundly affected by the actions of distant nations. While the continent had been largely shielded from direct invasion, it wasn't immune to the ripple effects of war. In the aftermath of these global conflicts, South America found itself scarred emotionally, socially, and economically. The people carried the weight of those lost years, the years when their young men were sent to fight wars they did not understand, and when the land they had fought for seemed to slip further away. Cities, once vibrant, now stood quieter, their streets filled with the echoes of the missing. Families grew distant, torn apart by the emotional wounds of war, by the loss of those they could never bring back. The scars of war would not fade quickly. South America found itself at a crossroads, caught between the old world and the new, its people forever changed by the choices made on distant battlefields. As the dust settled and the world tried to rebuild, the story of South America's role in these global conflicts became more than just a tale of neutrality and participation. It became the story of resilience. Of nations that stood tall, even when their world seemed to crumble, and of people who carried the weight of war and loss in ways that the outside world would never truly understand. Through the years, as nations healed and rebuilt, the legacy of those wars remained. The voices of the soldiers, the letters of the mothers, the dreams of the families, these were the memories that lived on. And the world, no matter how far removed, would never forget the quiet strength of South America in the face of a world that seemed too big to control, too loud to ignore. The cold wind of uncertainty swept across the continent, carrying with it whispers of power struggles and shifting loyalties. In the streets of Latin America, the tension was palpable, the fear and hope mingling in the hearts of those who had longed for change. The world was divided, with distant powers pulling the strings, and the promises of a brighter future felt fragile, like a candle flame in the wind. The Cold War was a storm that reached far beyond the borders of the United States and the Soviet Union. For the people of South America, it was a force that would shape their lives in ways they could not imagine. It was a time when every choice seemed to carry the weight of the world, and every movement was watched, analyzed, and judged by foreign powers. It began quietly, in the shadows, with the rising influence of the United States. From the north, its promises of prosperity, freedom, and security reached down like a hand that both helped and controlled. Latin America became the battleground for ideologies, capitalism versus communism, democracy versus dictatorship. As the U.S. feared the spread of communism like a wildfire, its influence began to seep into the region. It wasn't just about politics. It was about control. Control over nations, control over futures, and control over the hearts of people. In those early days, the people of South America were unsure of which side to choose. Some saw hope in the promises of revolution. They dreamed of a world where the rich no longer ruled the poor, where power was shared among the people. Others were afraid of losing what little they had left, afraid of the unknown that came with revolutionary change. Amid these fears, leaders emerged who promised answers, some with the charisma to inspire, others with the ruthlessness to force their will. But the promise of revolution and reform often gave way to something darker. In the wake of coups, new regimes rose, military dictatorships that crushed opposition, silenced dissent, and filled the streets with fear. These were the days when whispers could cost a life, when a glance in the wrong direction was enough to attract the attention of the military police. The governments in power, backed by the United States, sought to stamp out any signs of communist movements before they could grow. The streets became battlegrounds, and families found themselves torn between loyalty to their country and their need to survive. One of the most powerful symbols of this era came from a small island just off the coast. Cuba, a mere speck on the map, became the flashpoint for the Cold War in Latin America. When Fidel Castro and Che Guevara took to the hills in 1959, they ignited a revolution that would send shockwaves throughout the continent. Their success was a beacon of hope for many, a promise that change was possible, that the powerful could be overthrown. But for others, it was a nightmare. Castro's rise was not just a victory for the Cuban people, it was a signal that revolution could spread, that the winds of change could carry the scent of danger to every doorstep in Latin America. The Cuban Revolution did more than just change the course of Cuba's history, it altered the fate of an entire region. The United States, fearing the rise of communism, responded with hostility. The Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world to the brink of nuclear war, and the echoes of that conflict reverberated across Latin America. The success of the revolution gave hope to many farmers, workers, the oppressed, who saw in it the promise of a new society, one where the wealth was shared, where the voices of the poor were heard. But with hope came fear, and with fear came violence. The U.S., seeking to prevent the spread of communism, began to back military coups across the region, toppling governments that might have been sympathetic to revolutionary movements. It wasn't just political change that shook South America, it was the cost of that change. Those who stood up for what they believed in were silenced, often brutally. The revolutionaries became enemies of the state. They were hunted, imprisoned, or worse. The streets of Chile, Argentina, Brazil, and countless other nations became theaters for war, where the blood of the innocent was spilled in the name of power. The world looked on, but the people lived it, feeling the weight of every loss, every broken family, every empty chair at the table. It was an era when hope was often replaced by grief, when promises of justice turned into nightmares of oppression. The U.S. government's support of military regimes in Latin America deepened the divide. They saw the rise of dictatorships as the only way to prevent communism from taking hold. But these strongmen who took power were not saviors. They were tyrants, ruthless men who would stop at nothing to maintain control. The people they ruled were pawns in a game far bigger than they could comprehend. And yet, they fought, resisted, and dreamed of a better tomorrow, even as their lives were crushed under the weight of dictatorship. In the middle of this turmoil, the faces of the revolutionaries became icons, figures whose names would live forever in the hearts of the people. Castro, Guevara, Allende, these were the names that echoed in the streets, whispered in secret meetings, painted on the walls. They represented something more than just political ideologies, they represented the fight for a better world. But the road to that world was long and painful, filled with sacrifices and loss. Years passed, but the scars of the Cold War remained. The dictatorships fell, but the memories of what was lost never truly disappeared. Families still mourned the disappeared, the men and women taken in the night, their fates unknown. And though the revolution seemed to fade, their spirit lived on in the hearts of the people, in the struggles that continued in the face of adversity. The Cold War in South America was not just a battle of political systems, it was a battle for the soul of the continent. The people of South America fought for their freedom, for their right to dream of a life without fear. And though the world seemed indifferent to their pain, they kept fighting. The struggle would go on, long after the weapons were silenced, long after the leaders had come and gone. In the hearts of the people, the fire of revolution would never be extinguished. The sun had just begun to rise over the streets of Buenos Aires when the announcement was made. The city, so long accustomed to the harsh rhythms of dictatorship, now stirred to the sound of a new dawn. A deep, uneasy breath swept through the air as the people waited, unsure of what would come next. The past decades of terror and uncertainty, of whispers in the dark and knocks on the door, had left scars that ran deeper than anyone could imagine. But there, in the heart of the nation, something was changing. The military regimes that had ruled with iron fists were starting to crumble. And with that collapse, a fragile hope began to unfurl. It was a hope born from the unyielding strength of those who had fought, who had never stopped believing in a better future. It was a hope woven through every march, every rally, and every life lost to the forces of oppression. Democracy, long thought a distant dream, a forgotten memory, was suddenly within reach. But for the people, the road ahead was far from simple. In the early days of transition, the joy of freedom felt almost too big to hold. The streets filled with tears, both of joy and sorrow. Families were reunited, their lost loved ones finally returned from the shadows, though the scars of their years apart would never fade. But it wasn't long before the harsh realities of rebuilding became clear. The old wounds of the past, the disappearances, the torture, the years of silence, weren't things that could be wiped away with the simple return of elections. There were ghosts in the streets, in the homes, and in the hearts of the people, and no amount of celebration could erase them. Governments shifted, leaders came and went, but it felt like the country was stuck between the past and the future. Promises of reform echoed through the air, But the truth was, no one really knew how to begin the work of healing. The military had ruled with such force, had controlled so much of the nation's lifeblood, that the weight of their departure was staggering. The people wanted change, but they also feared it. What would life look like now? How could the deep divides be mended? For many, the pain of the past couldn't just be forgotten. The dark years were still alive in the minds of those who had lived through them. There were whispers in the streets about those who had disappeared, who had been taken in the night and never returned. It wasn't just about the families left behind, it was about an entire society that had been forced to live in fear, to accept the idea that power could be wielded like a weapon, destroying anything in its path. And yet, amidst all the darkness, there were those who believed in the power of democracy. There were those who had risked everything to see this moment, the moment when they could walk freely, speak openly, vote without fear of reprisal. These were the hearts that kept the flame of hope alive. They didn't see democracy as a system of government, they saw it as a lifeline, a way to finally let the country breathe again. But it wasn't easy. The weight of the past hung over the new governments like an anchor, pulling at every step forward. Reconciliation was not something that could be forced, not something that could be declared by a speech or an election. It required time, patience, and a willingness to face the truth, however painful it might be. The new leaders, eager to move the country forward, often found themselves caught between the desire for progress and the need to address the deep, unresolved scars of the past. And still, the people waited. The streets buzzed with conversations, ideas, dreams for the future. There was a hunger for change, but there was also fears that the darkness of the past would somehow return, that the military might rise again, that the power that had once been taken away could easily be seized once more. It was a fragile democracy, and the cracks were visible from the start. How could a country that had been broken by years of oppression put itself back together? Could a nation that had lived in silence and fear for so long ever learn how to speak its truth? The struggles were not just political, they were deeply personal. People who had fought for democracy, who had been imprisoned for their beliefs, now had to find their place in a world where the system was new, uncertain, and frail. It wasn't enough to just hold an election and declare victory. Democracy had to be lived, day by day, and the choices people made, and the way they treated each other, and the way they looked at their history and dared to ask, what kind of future do we want to build? It wasn't just about politics, it was about trust. Trust in the system, trust in the leaders, and trust in each other. And that trust was fragile, delicate, like a leaf trembling in the wind. Some turned to the past for answers, clinging to old ways of doing things, unable to let go of the ghosts that still haunted them. Others reached forward, ready to leave behind the pain of what had been and build something new, something better. But both sides felt the weight of the country's trauma. The country was walking a tightrope between the past and the future, its every step precarious, its every movement watched by those who had been hurt, by those who still feared that democracy might not last. And then, one day, something shifted. Slowly, painfully, the old systems of power began to crack. The military no longer ruled with force, and the people began to reclaim their voices. Democracy, in its fragile form, began to take root. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't without its flaws. But for the first time in so many years, there was a chance, a real chance, to rebuild. The people began to see that democracy wasn't just about who sat in power, it was about the rights of every individual to live without fear, to speak their truth, and to fight for a better future. The work of healing was long, and there were many who never saw the results of their sacrifices. But there were also those who, against all odds, believed in the power of the people to change their destiny. And though the road ahead was still uncertain, the first steps had been taken, and the hope for a brighter tomorrow began to bloom, one small victory at a time. The air was thick with dust as the steam from the mine shafts rose into the pale sky. The workers, worn and weary, their faces as weathered as the land itself, toiled beneath the unforgiving sun. In the distance, the slow-moving ships filled with precious minerals, the lifeblood of South America's economy, began to set sail across the wide ocean. With each ship, the continent's story was rewritten, of riches, of power, of struggle. Yet, beneath the surface of this great economic engine, there was a tension, a sense of fragility, a question that lingered like a shadow. Could the wealth of the land ever truly bring prosperity to its people? The landscape of South America was carved by the hands of those who worked its fertile soil and dug into its deep mines. Agriculture, from the vast fields of soybeans to the golden crops of wheat and coffee, painted the continent in hues of green and brown. The soil fed not only the people of South America but the hungry mouths of the world. The products that flowed from these lands, rich and varied, found their way across oceans, through markets, into foreign hands. The continent was alive with the pulse of trade, its heart beating to the rhythm of global demand. Yet for all the wealth that the land produced, the people who worked it were often left with empty hands. The riches were too often siphoned away by foreign powers or concentrated in the hands of a few, leaving the majority to wrestle with poverty, inequality, and the harshest of conditions. The land could give, but it could also take. For centuries, South America's natural resources had been exploited, with little to show for it except for the widening gap between the rich and the poor. As the continent grappled with this paradox, there came a glimmer of hope. Amid the winds of change, a dream began to take shape, the dream of regional unity, of coming together to forge a future that was not just defined by exports and minerals but by shared prosperity, by mutual growth. Mercosur was born, a step toward something larger, something that could transcend the old divisions of the past. The idea of integration wasn't just about trade or politics, it was a lifeline, a promise that if the nations of South America worked together, they could create something stronger than the sum of their parts. It wasn't an easy road, and it was filled with obstacles, competing interests, cultural differences, long-standing rivalries. But beneath all that was a deep yearning for change, for something better than what had come before. The promise of Mercosur was not just economic, it was the hope of unity, of strength through collaboration, of building something that would stand firm in the face of global challenges. As the years passed, the fruits of this collaboration began to show. Cross-border trade became easier, the flow of goods smoother. The once bleak markets began to buzz with activity, with a sense of possibility that hadn't existed before. South America, once so fragmented, was starting to see the power of unity, and with that unity came the potential for economic transformation. It wasn't just about the wealthy corporations or the governments, it was about the farmers, the laborers, the artisans, the small business owners who suddenly had access to markets and opportunities that had once been closed to them. It was about the people. But even as the economies of South America began to grow, the challenges remained. The uneven distribution of wealth still cast a long shadow over the region. The mines continued to dig deep into the earth, the workers continued to labor, but the rewards were slow to come. The land was rich, yes, but it was also vulnerable, and the global demand for its resources often meant that the people who lived on it could not always enjoy the fruits of their labor. And yet, in the face of adversity, the spirit of the people never waned. The farmers, their hands calloused from years of toil, continued to plant their crops, nurturing them through seasons of drought and rain, driven by the hope that their harvest might one day bring more than survival. The small-scale entrepreneurs worked tirelessly to grow their businesses, to build a future not just for themselves, but for their families and their communities. Mercosur, with all its imperfections, provided a glimmer of hope that South America could unite not just for economic gain, but for a better future for all its people. It was a work in progress, a constantly evolving dream that required sacrifice, compromise, and, above all, patience. But even as the region's leaders signed trade deals and shook hands over agreements, the people of South America, the farmers, the miners, the traders, continued their quiet, uncelebrated work, the true backbone of the continent's economy. The transformation was not just about numbers on a page or commodities traded in far-off markets. It was about the everyday lives of the people who lived in the shadows of these vast industries. It was about the workers who found new hope in regional trade agreements, the farmers who could now sell their goods at better prices, the families who had the chance to live better lives. Economic transformations were not simply changes in policies or trade routes, they were changes in the very fabric of South American society. But that transformation was never easy. Each step forward came with its own set of challenges. The hopes of regional integration were often dashed by the realities of politics, by the competing ambitions of each nation, by the deep scars of past divisions. But still, the people persisted. They found strength in their shared struggles, and the understanding that they were not alone, that through cooperation, they might just be able to build something more resilient, something more lasting. As the ships continued to sail, as the crops continued to grow, and as the agreements continued to be signed, South America's place in the global economy was being rewritten. The old patterns were being broken, the old inequalities challenged. It was slow, it was hard, but it was progress. And with every small victory, with every new connection made, the people of South America began to believe that, maybe, just maybe, the wealth of the land could be shared more equally, that the future could hold something brighter for everyone. The sound of drums echoed through the mountains as a group of indigenous women, their faces painted with the bright colors of their ancestors, marched toward the city square. Their eyes, though tired from years of struggle, shone with the determination of a people who had been silenced for too long. They held their heads high, their voices ringing out in the air, demanding something that should have always been theirs: recognition. For centuries, the indigenous peoples of South America had been pushed to the margins, their lands taken, their voices ignored, their cultures misunderstood. The colonizers came, and with them, the idea that their way of life was superior, their systems more just, their beliefs more civilized. The native peoples, who had lived on these lands long before the first European ship touched its shores, were treated as if they were invisible, like shadows on the land they once called home. But the shadows had begun to stir. They were no longer content to be forgotten. The hunger for justice, for a chance to be seen and heard, had ignited in the hearts of many, and what began as small, quiet protests had grown into a movement that could not be stopped. It was not just a fight for land, but a fight for dignity. A fight for the right to live, to breathe, to exist in a world that had long since chosen to overlook their existence. The struggle was not only about political rights or economic equality. It was a matter of survival, of preserving the very identity of indigenous peoples, their languages, their customs, their connection to the land. These struggles played out in every corner of South America, in the vast rainforests of the Amazon and the high plains of the Andes, and in the bustling cities where the voices of indigenous people had too often been drowned out by the noise of power. The protests grew louder. The indigenous peoples began to demand that the land, which had been stripped away from them by centuries of greed and exploitation, be returned. They called for their rights to be recognized in the law. They demanded that their cultures, their stories, their languages not be erased from the pages of history. As the movement grew, so did the enemies they faced. The same corporations that had long profited from the land began to push back, claiming that development, that progress, was more important than the preservation of the earth. But the indigenous peoples knew something that the world had long since forgotten, that the land, the rivers, the forests, were not just resources to be consumed, they were sacred. They were part of the very fabric of who they were. In the Amazon, as the deforestation continued at an alarming rate, the indigenous communities rose in protest, fighting not only for their homes but for the planet itself. The air was thick with the smoke of burning trees, and the cries of animals whose habitats were being destroyed echoed through the night. It was a fight against time, a fight against a system that valued money over life, a fight that few understood outside the communities living on the front lines. Yet, despite the obstacles, the courage of the indigenous peoples never wavered. They stood tall, knowing that if they did not fight, the world would forget them, and the earth itself would suffer. Environmental activism became their battle cry, and with it came a message that resonated across the globe: the health of the planet and the rights of indigenous peoples are inseparable. In the cities, the call for recognition grew stronger. Indigenous leaders, some of whom had once been cast aside, rose to prominence, their voices amplified by the power of social media. What once seemed impossible, being heard in a world that had ignored them for so long, was now within their grasp. Their stories, their struggles, were being shared by people from all corners of the globe. They were no longer fighting alone. The world was beginning to listen. But the fight was far from over. The battle for land was still being waged in the courts, in the streets, and in the hearts of people who believed in justice. It was a fight that took its toll. Lives were lost. Families were torn apart. But the hope that one day the land would be returned, the cultures would be respected, and the people would be given their rightful place in the world kept the movement alive. There were moments when the weight of it all seemed unbearable. When the overwhelming force of progress, of industrialization, seemed impossible to challenge. When the bright light of city life shone so brightly that the ancient ways of the indigenous peoples seemed like distant memories. But there was something powerful, something unshakable, in their resistance. It was the same spirit that had carried them through centuries of oppression. It was the connection to the earth, to their ancestors, to the very essence of who they were. And slowly, the world began to change. The voices of the indigenous peoples were no longer drowned out by the roar of machinery or the bustle of the cities. Their stories, their songs, their dances, began to find their place in the broader narrative of South America. And though the fight for equality was far from over, there was a growing recognition that the future could not be built without acknowledging the past. From the Amazon to the Andes, from the streets of Buenos Aires to the highlands of Bolivia, the movement for indigenous rights continued to gain momentum. And as the winds of change blew across the continent, it became clear that the struggle was not just for the land, but for the soul of South America itself. The fight for indigenous rights was not just about reclaiming what had been taken, but about reshaping the future, about ensuring that the generations to come would inherit a world where every voice was heard, every life was valued, and the earth was respected as the sacred gift it always had been. In the end, the story of South America was no longer one of silence. It was a story of resilience, of unity, of people standing together to demand their rights, to demand justice, and to protect the planet for generations to come. And in that fight, the heartbeat of the land could be felt once again, as strong and steady as it had ever been. The streets of Bogotá buzzed with the hum of life, a mosaic of voices, footsteps, and dreams echoing through the city. Somewhere in the heart of the bustling plaza, a young girl sat on a bench, a book in her hands, her lips moving silently as she read. Her eyes held the spark of hope, hope that her generation might write a different story for South America, one where opportunities were not confined to a privileged few, but where every child had the chance to dream, to grow, to thrive. Yet, beyond her hopeful gaze, the continent stood at a crossroads. South America was a land of contrasts, its beauty unmatched, its challenges undeniable. From the sweeping Andes to the depths of the Amazon, it was a region both rich in resources and burdened by history. The choices made today would determine the course of tomorrow, and the stakes had never been higher. In the political sphere, the winds of change blew with an uneasy rhythm. Governments rose and fell as the people demanded more than promises. They wanted action. Corruption, that old shadow, still clung to many corridors of power, but it was being met with a new kind of resistance. Citizens, armed with their votes and their voices, were standing against it, fueled by a belief that their countries could, and should, be better. In Brazil, debates over deforestation raged as the Amazon, often called the lungs of the earth, stood on the brink. Activists and indigenous leaders, risking their lives, fought against illegal logging and land grabs, knowing that the fight was not just for the rainforest, but for the planet itself. Their courage was a stark reminder that progress could not come at the expense of the earth. Economically, South America was a continent of vast potential, yet grappling with stark inequalities. In the sprawling markets of Lima, vendors sold their wares, weaving through a sea of shoppers struggling to stretch their pesos. In gleaming boardrooms high above Santiago, deals were being made that could shape the continent's future in global trade. Agriculture remained a cornerstone of the economy, its fields feeding millions both at home and abroad. Mining, too, played its part, with the treasures of the earth, gold, silver, lithium, offered to the world. Yet, the question lingered, who truly benefited from this wealth? Amid the contrasts, there were stories of triumph. Families lifted out of poverty, children attending school for the first time, communities coming together to build a better future. In cities like Buenos Aires, technology hubs were blossoming, their innovation lighting the way toward a digital future. But alongside these victories came challenges, unemployment, inflation, and the ever-present threat of external debt hanging over economies like a storm cloud. Socially, South America was alive with energy and transformation. The people were demanding their rights with a voice that could no longer be ignored. Women, long sidelined in many aspects of society, were leading movements that reshaped norms and laws, fighting for equality in the workplace, in politics, and in their homes. The LGBTQ+ community, too, was standing tall, reclaiming spaces that had long excluded them, and demanding dignity and respect. In small rural villages, young activists worked tirelessly to bring education and healthcare to the forgotten corners of their nations. In crowded urban centers, protesters gathered to call for better wages, affordable housing, and an end to violence. These struggles, big and small, painted a picture of a continent fighting not just for survival, but for a better life for all. South America's role on the global stage was evolving. With its natural resources, it held power in trade negotiations, its commodities vital to industries around the world. The continent's unique biodiversity, from its rainforests to its coastlines, placed it at the forefront of environmental discussions. Leaders from across the region attended international summits, their voices growing stronger in calls for sustainable development and climate action. Yet, this influence came with responsibilities. The choices made today in the name of economic growth could have consequences that stretched far beyond borders. The world watched as South America navigated this balancing act, its decisions shaping not just its own destiny but the future of the planet. The faces of the future were not just those of politicians and CEOs, but of ordinary people determined to make a difference. A farmer in Ecuador, adopting sustainable practices to protect his land for generations to come. A teacher in Paraguay, instilling hope and knowledge in children who would one day lead. A scientist in Argentina, researching renewable energy solutions that could transform the continent. Together, they were shaping the story of South America. In Colombia, a woman stood at the forefront of a community project, bringing solar energy to remote villages where darkness once ruled the night. In Chile, a young man designed programs to help marginalized groups access education and jobs. Across the continent, there were countless such stories of resilience, of ingenuity, of hope. The future of South America was being written every day in these acts of courage and compassion. And while the challenges were great, poverty, political instability, environmental threats, the spirit of the people burned brighter. They were artists, workers, students, leaders, each one playing their part in shaping a continent that would not just survive but thrive. It was in the laughter of children playing soccer on the dusty streets of a small town. It was in the rhythm of drums at a protest demanding change. It was in the determination of a scientist working late into the night, believing in the power of her research. It was in the love of a grandmother teaching her grandchildren the songs of their ancestors, ensuring their culture would live on. South America was a continent of dreams, of resilience, of fire and passion. And while the road ahead would not be easy, the people of this land had shown time and again that they were capable of rising to any challenge. With their strength, their ingenuity, and their unyielding hope, they were creating a tomorrow that honored their past while embracing the promise of what lay ahead.